One afternoon, Charles Griffin, a middle-aged black man in a sharp suit and a Maga hat, enters the restaurant and takes a seat. Charles's calm demeanor contrasts sharply with the attention drawn by his bold red hat, a symbol that immediately unsettles David. For David, the hat represents ideologies and values he strongly opposes. When tasked with serving Charles, he refuses, citing discomfort with what the hat symbolizes. He insists that he cannot serve someone who, in his mind, embodies such beliefs. What follows is a confrontation that will not only go viral, but spark a nationwide conversation about tolerance, identity, and the fine line between personal beliefs and public policy. Before we dive into this story, share your initial thoughts. Should businesses have the right to refuse service based on political symbols? Charles Griffin was a man who had seen the best and worst of what life had to offer. Born and raised in a tight-knit community in Atlanta, Georgia, Charles grew up in a family that valued hard work and resilience. His father, a small business owner, instilled in him the importance of perseverance and integrity, while his mother, a schoolteacher, taught him the value of education and empathy. These lessons shaped him into the man he was today, a successful entrepreneur and community advocate. On a sunny afternoon, Charles walked into one of his restaurants, not as an owner but as a customer. Wearing a crisp navy suit and his signature red Maga hat, he stepped through the doors with quiet confidence. To Charles, the hat represented his complex beliefs, his hope for economic opportunity, and his desire for a better future for all Americans, though he was aware of the polarizing perceptions it carried. As he surveyed the bustling restaurant, Charles chose a window-side booth and settled in, ready for a quiet lunch. He had no idea that his simple choice of attire would spark an encounter that would challenge deeply held beliefs, not just for the staff, but for himself as well. Among the staff was David, an experienced waiter with a reputation for being sharp, efficient, and outspoken. David noticed Charles immediately. His initial reaction was visceral, a tightening in his chest and a simmering discomfort. The red hat felt like a flashing signal, representing beliefs and ideologies David deeply opposed. It wasn't just a hat to him. It was a statement, one he couldn't ignore. Taking a deep breath, David grabbed his notepad and walked toward the booth. His usual easygoing demeanor was replaced with a sense of tension. As he approached, he forced a polite smile. "Good afternoon, sir. Can I help you find a seat elsewhere?" Charles looked up, his calm eyes meeting David's. "No, thank you. I'm comfortable right here. I'd like a menu, please." David hesitated, his fingers tightening around his notepad. "I'm sorry, but I can't serve you," he said flatly. "You'll need to leave." And with those words, the day took an unexpected turn. The air between David and Charles grew heavier with tension as the initial exchange echoed in David's mind. He stood stiffly by the table, his professional mask slipping to reveal the discomfort beneath. Around them, the bustling restaurant carried on, though nearby patrons began to notice the exchange. Charles remained seated, his calm and composed demeanor in stark contrast to David's mounting unease. Charles tilted his head slightly, his expression neutral but inquisitive. "I'm sorry, did I hear you correctly? You said you can't serve me?" David nodded, his jaw tightening. "That's right, I can't." Charles leaned back in the booth, his hands resting lightly on the table. "And may I ask why that is?" His tone was polite, devoid of anger, but there was a quiet firmness to it that demanded an honest answer. David hesitated for a moment, weighing his words. He didn't want to escalate the situation, but he also felt strongly about standing his ground. "It's your hat," he finally said, his voice steady but edged with tension. "It represents things I don't agree with, things I can't condone." Charles regarded him thoughtfully, his gaze unwavering. "I see. So, because of my hat, you've decided that I don't deserve to be served?" David crossed his arms, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "I have a right to refuse service if I feel uncomfortable." Charles's eyebrows raised slightly, but his expression remained composed. "That's an interesting position to take, especially in a place like this. Do you often refuse service to people who don't share your beliefs?" David's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's not about beliefs. It's about what that hat stands for." "And what exactly do you think it stands for?" Charles asked, his voice still calm but tinged with curiosity. "Do you know anything about me, as a person, beyond this hat?" David faltered, unsure how to respond. He had made an assumption, and now he was being forced to confront it. "I don't need to know you personally to understand what that symbol means," he replied, his tone defensive. At that moment, Rachel, the restaurant manager, approached. She had noticed the growing tension and decided to intervene before the situation spiraled further. Her professional demeanor contrasted sharply with the charged emotions at the table. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her gaze shifting between David and Charles. David spoke quickly, eager to justify himself. "I've told this gentleman that I can't serve him," he said, his voice firm. "I don't feel comfortable." Rachel frowned, her expression a mix of confusion and concern. "And why is that, David?" David gestured toward Charles. "It's the hat," he said flatly. "It stands for things I can't support." Rachel's brow furrowed as she turned to Charles, offering an apologetic smile. "I'm very sorry about this, sir. Please allow me to take your order personally." Charles nodded graciously. "Thank you. I appreciate that. I'll have the house special and a black coffee." As Rachel jotted down the order and left to place it with the kitchen, David remained rooted to the spot, his arms crossed and his face tight with frustration. He watched as Rachel treated Charles with the professionalism he had refused to muster, and a sense of betrayal simmered within him. Returning to his other tables, David struggled to focus on his duties. His frustration with Rachel's decision and his discomfort with Charles's presence weighed heavily on him. He felt as though his beliefs had been dismissed, his stance undermined. Yet, as he glanced toward the booth by the window, he noticed that Charles seemed entirely unbothered by the encounter. He sat quietly, sipping his coffee and observing the restaurant with a thoughtful expression. When Rachel returned with Charles's order, she ensured that he was well taken care of, her tone warm and professional. "If there's anything else you need, sir, please don't hesitate to let me know," she said. Charles smiled. "Thank you. It's rare to see someone handle a situation like this with such professionalism." Rachel hesitated, unsure how to respond to the comment, but she offered a polite smile before returning to her duties. Charles finished his meal without incident, leaving a generous tip for Rachel before he stood, adjusted his jacket, and exited the restaurant. From across the room, David watched him leave, his annoyance still simmering. He couldn't understand how Rachel could so easily dismiss the significance of the hat or why Charles had remained so calm throughout the encounter. To David, it felt like a defeat, a compromise of the values he held so dearly. As the restaurant quieted down after the lunch rush, Rachel called David aside to discuss the incident. Her tone was firm but measured, her words chosen carefully. "David, I need to talk to you about what happened earlier with the customer in the Maga hat." David sighed, crossing his arms defensively. "I don't regret what I did, Rachel. That hat represents things I can't support. I had every right to refuse service." Rachel frowned. "You may feel strongly about your beliefs, but that doesn't excuse unprofessional behavior. Our job is to serve everyone who walks through that door, regardless of their personal beliefs or symbols they wear. You let your emotions get in the way of your responsibilities." David shook his head, his frustration mounting. "So, you're saying I should just ignore what I believe in and serve people who stand for things I can't accept?" "I'm saying you need to separate your personal feelings from your professional duties," Rachel replied firmly. "You don't have to agree with every customer, but you do have to treat them with respect. That's the standard we uphold here." David opened his mouth to argue further, but Rachel raised a hand to stop him. "This isn't up for debate, David. What you did today wasn't right, and we need to address it." Meanwhile, at his home, Charles sat in his office, reflecting on the day's events. Despite the disrespect he had faced, he felt no anger toward David. Instead, he felt a quiet determination to address the issue constructively. He had seen people act out of ignorance and prejudice before, and he believed in the power of second chances. Picking up his phone, he dialed the restaurant. "Thank you for calling Bright Horizons Bistro." Rachel's voice came through. "This is Rachel speaking." "Good evening, Rachel. This is Charles Griffin. I dined at your restaurant earlier today, and I'd like to discuss the incident involving your server." Rachel's heart sank, but she maintained her professionalism. "Mr. Griffin, I deeply apologize." Charles interrupted gently. "No need to apologize. I appreciate how you handled the situation. However, I believe this is something we need to address together. There's something else you should know. I'm not just a customer. I'm the owner of Bright Horizons Bistro." Rachel froze, the weight of his words sinking in. "You're the owner?" "Yes," Charles confirmed. "I'd like to meet with you and David tomorrow to discuss this further." Rachel agreed immediately, her mind racing. The next day promised to be a turning point, not just for David, but for the restaurant as a whole. The following morning, Charles sat at the desk in his spacious home office, sipping his usual black coffee as sunlight streamed through the windows. The events of the previous day replayed in his mind, not with anger, but with a thoughtful determination to address the issue. Charles was not the type to let incidents like this pass without reflection. For him, the restaurant was more than a business. It was a space he had built to foster community, inclusion, and respect. What happened with David wasn't just a lapse in professionalism. It struck at the core of what he stood for. Despite the personal offense, Charles felt no desire for retribution. Instead, he saw an opportunity for growth, both for David and the restaurant. Pulling out his phone, he dialed the restaurant's main line, resolved to address the matter constructively. Rachel picked up on the second ring, her voice as professional as ever. "Thank you for calling Bright Horizons Bistro. This is Rachel speaking. How can I help you?" "Good morning, Rachel," Charles said, his tone calm but deliberate. "This is Charles Griffin. I dined at your restaurant yesterday, and I'd like to discuss an experience I had." Rachel immediately recognized his voice. "Mr. Griffin, yes, of course. I hope everything was satisfactory with your meal." Charles nodded slightly, though she couldn't see him. "The food and service from you, in particular, were excellent. Thank you for stepping in. However, I'd like to address the behavior of one of your staff members, David, I believe." Rachel's professional tone grew cautious. "I see. Please go on." Charles recounted the incident succinctly, ensuring not to exaggerate or vilify David. "I understand people have differing beliefs, and I respect that. But refusing service based on personal opinions undermines the values of the restaurant and creates an uncomfortable environment for everyone." Rachel sighed audibly, her disappointment evident. "I deeply apologize for what happened, Mr. Griffin. That is not how we operate, and I assure you I will address this with David immediately." "Thank you," Charles replied. Then, after a pause, he added, "One more thing. You should know I'm not just a customer. I'm the owner of Bright Horizons Bistro." Rachel gasped audibly. "You're the owner?" "Yes," Charles confirmed. "I'd like to meet with you and David later today to resolve this matter." Rachel agreed, her voice tinged with nerves. "Of course, Mr. Griffin. I'll make the arrangements." As Charles ended the call, his mind remained focused. He wasn't seeking to punish David, but to turn this conflict into a lesson in professionalism and respect. For Charles, it was about more than a single incident. It was about upholding the principles he had built his business on. Later that day, Rachel called David into her office, her expression neutral but firm. David entered with a guarded posture, already suspecting the reason for the meeting. He closed the door behind him, crossing his arms as he waited for her to speak. "This is about yesterday, isn't it?" he said curtly. Rachel nodded, gesturing for him to sit. "It is. I've spoken with Mr. Griffin, the gentleman you refused to serve." David frowned, his defensiveness immediate. "I had my reasons, Rachel." "That hat." Rachel raised a hand to stop him. "David, this is serious. Refusing service based on personal beliefs is not acceptable here, and you know that." David opened his mouth to argue, but Rachel's tone hardened. "Let me finish. Mr. Griffin called this morning to share his experience, and he raised some valid concerns about how this reflects on the restaurant." David scoffed. "Of course he did. People like him." "Stop," Rachel interrupted sharply, her eyes locked on his, her voice dropping to a quieter but more pointed tone. "Do you know who Mr. Griffin is?" David hesitated, the question catching him off guard. "A customer?" he said cautiously, his tone betraying his uncertainty. Rachel folded her hands on the desk and leaned forward. He's the owner of this restaurant. The words landed like a hammer, and David's face went pale. What? He managed to say after a moment of stunned silence. That's right, Rachel confirmed, her tone unwavering. Mr. Griffin owns Bright Horizons Bistro. Yesterday, he chose not to reveal his identity, but he made it clear this morning. He's been observing how we operate, and what happened didn't just disappoint him. It undermines the very values this place was built on. David sank back in his chair, the weight of the revelation settling on him. I didn't know, he muttered, his defensiveness crumbling into disbelief. No, you didn't, Rachel said, her voice softening slightly. And that's part of the problem. You judged him without knowing anything about him. She straightened and added, Mr. Griffin has requested a meeting with both of us this afternoon. I suggest you prepare yourself for the conversation. David nodded numbly, the full gravity of his actions beginning to sink in. The atmosphere in the restaurant office was heavy with tension as the appointed meeting time approached. David sat on a chair near Rachel's desk, fidgeting nervously with his hands. His usual confidence was replaced by an uneasy apprehension, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Across from him, Rachel stood by the window, her professional demeanor masking her own nervousness. She was used to handling workplace conflicts, but this was no ordinary situation. When the door opened, Charles entered with the same calm composure he had displayed the day before. Dressed in another sharp suit, he carried himself with quiet authority. His presence immediately filled the room, though his expression was neutral. He glanced at Rachel and David, offering a polite nod. Good afternoon, he said evenly. Good afternoon, Mr. Griffin, Rachel replied, gesturing for him to take a seat. David mumbled a quiet greeting, avoiding eye contact as Charles settled into a chair across from them. Charles folded his hands on the desk, his gaze steady but not unkind as he looked at David. I wanted to meet with you directly to discuss what happened yesterday, he began, his tone calm but firm. I'd like to hear your perspective. David swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He hesitated before speaking, knowing there was no way to avoid the topic. I didn't feel comfortable serving you, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Your hat. It represents things I strongly disagree with. I thought I had the right to refuse service because of how it made me feel. Charles nodded slowly, giving no immediate reaction. I see, he said after a pause. And do you believe it's fair to judge someone solely based on what they're wearing? David hesitated, searching for an answer. It's not just about the hat, he said defensively. It's what it stands for. And what do I stand for? Charles asked, his voice steady but pointed. Do you know me? Do you know my values, my beliefs, or my history? David shook his head, his defensiveness beginning to crumble. No, he admitted. I don't. Charles leaned forward slightly, his tone softening but still firm. David, I respect your right to hold personal beliefs, and I don't expect everyone to agree with mine. But when you're working here, your responsibility is to treat every customer with respect, regardless of your personal opinions. That's not just a rule. It's a principle this restaurant was built on. David's face flushed with shame. I understand, he said quietly. I wasn't thinking clearly. Charles took a deep breath, his expression thoughtful. I've decided not to terminate your employment, he said, his voice even. However, I believe some time away will help you reflect on the importance of professionalism and respect. Effective immediately, you'll be laid off for 2 weeks. David's eyes widened, his voice cracking. Laid off? Yes, Charles confirmed. This is not a punishment, but an opportunity for growth. Use this time wisely. David nodded, his voice barely audible. I understand. Thank you. As Charles left the office, the weight of the encounter left David shaken. He knew the next 2 weeks would be pivotal. David spent the first few days of his 2-week layoff in a haze of emotions, anger, shame, and confusion warring within him. He paced his small apartment, replaying the meeting with Charles over and over in his mind. While part of him still clung to the justification of his actions, a growing part felt the sting of regret. Was I really that wrong? He muttered to himself, staring at the ceiling late one night. Seeking clarity, David reached out to people he trusted. He called his best friend, Josh, hoping for validation. "You did what you felt was right," Josh said confidently. "If the guy's hat made you uncomfortable, that's on him, not you." David appreciated the support, but the words felt hollow. Something about Charles's calm, thoughtful demeanor lingered in his mind, nagging at his initial conviction. A few days later, David visited his older sister, Clara, a teacher with a reputation for wisdom and patience. Over coffee, he recounted the incident, from his refusal to serve Charles to the revelation of his identity. Clara listened quietly, her expression unreadable until David finished. "David," she began, her tone gentle but firm, "I understand why you felt the way you did, but you let your personal feelings interfere with your job. That's not who you are. You've always been someone who gives others a chance." David opened his mouth to argue but stopped. Deep down, he knew she was right. Her next words struck a chord. People rarely change through confrontation. Sometimes, the best way to influence someone is through kindness and respect, even when you disagree with them. Later that night, curiosity led David to Google Charles Griffin. As he scrolled through search results, his initial embarrassment deepened into genuine humility. Article after article highlighted Charles's philanthropic efforts, providing jobs to single parents, mentoring young people, and donating to local charities. Testimonials from former employees painted a picture of a man who cared deeply about his community, regardless of background or beliefs. David stared at his laptop screen, a sinking feeling settling in his chest. "I judged him without knowing a thing about him," he admitted aloud. The realization was sobering. By the end of the week, David's perspective had shifted. He still held his personal beliefs, but he now understood the danger of allowing them to cloud his professionalism and humanity. With this clarity, he sat down at his desk, grabbed a pen and paper, and began writing an apology letter to Charles. "Dear Mr. Griffin," he started, pouring his thoughts and regrets onto the page, determined to make amends. David's 2 weeks of layoff had felt like an eternity. By the time the day came for him to return to work, he had rehearsed his apology to Charles countless times. Yet his nerves still gripped him. Clutching the letter he had written, David walked through the doors of Bright Horizons Bistro, the familiar sounds of clinking dishes and chatter washing over him. But the restaurant felt different now, warmer, heavier with meaning. Rachel greeted him near the counter with a small nod. "Welcome back, David," she said, her tone neutral. "Mr. Griffin is here. He asked to speak with you when you arrived." David's stomach churned. "Thanks, Rachel," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. With the letter tucked into his pocket, he made his way to the corner booth where Charles sat, reviewing a stack of papers. Charles looked up as David approached, setting the papers aside. His expression was calm, unreadable, but not unkind. "Good morning, David," he said evenly. "Good morning, Mr. Griffin," David replied, his voice quieter than he intended. "May I sit?" Charles gestured to the seat across from him. "Please." David sat, his hands clasped nervously in front of him. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence thick with unspoken tension. Finally, David reached into his pocket and pulled out the letter, sliding it across the table. "I wrote this for you," he said, his voice faltering. "But I'd like to say it in person if that's okay." Charles nodded, folding his hands and giving David his full attention. David took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "Mr. Griffin, I want to apologize for the way I treated you. I let my personal feelings get in the way of my job, and it wasn't right. I judged you without knowing anything about you, and I regret it deeply." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "These past 2 weeks, I've thought a lot about what happened. I've learned more about who you are and the values you stand for, and I realize now that I was wrong. You deserved better from me, not just as a customer, but as a person." Charles studied him for a moment, his expression softening. "Thank you, David," he said quietly. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, and I appreciate your sincerity." David felt a wave of relief wash over him, though he knew this wasn't the end of the conversation. Charles leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, what have you learned from this?" David nodded, his voice steady now. "I've learned that it's not my place to judge others, especially in a professional setting. I still hold my beliefs, but I understand now that respect has to come first. Charles smiled faintly. Good. That's a step in the right direction. I'm not looking for perfection, David. I'm looking for growth. For the first time in weeks, David felt hopeful. David returned to work determined to prove he had learned from his mistakes. The first few days back were challenging. His colleagues were cordial but reserved, their hesitation evident in the way they interacted with him. David couldn't blame them. He knew he had to rebuild trust, not just with Charles but with the entire team. Throwing himself into his work, David focused on every detail of his job. He greeted customers warmly, managed difficult situations with patience, and offered to help his coworkers whenever they needed it. His actions spoke louder than words, and slowly, the tension began to ease. One particularly busy afternoon, David noticed a new hire, a young waitress named Emma, struggling with an order from a demanding customer. She looked flustered, on the verge of tears. Without hesitation, David stepped in to assist. "Let me help you with this," he said gently, guiding her through the interaction and calming the customer. Afterward, Emma looked at him with gratitude. "Thank you," she said. "I don't think I could have handled that alone." David smiled. "We've all been there. Just remember, treat everyone with respect, even when it's hard. It makes a difference." Rachel, who had been observing from across the restaurant, approached David later that day. "You've been stepping up a lot lately," she said. "It hasn't gone unnoticed." "Thanks," David replied, his tone humble. "I'm just trying to make things right." Rachel nodded, her expression softening. "You're doing a good job." Over time, David's growth became evident to everyone at the restaurant. Even customers noticed his renewed dedication and positive attitude. He found himself reflecting more often on the lessons he had learned from Charles. The man he had once dismissed as a symbol of opposition had become a role model for professionalism, grace, and leadership. One evening, as the restaurant was closing, David approached Charles, who was reviewing paperwork in his usual corner booth. "Mr. Griffin," he said, his voice steady, "I just wanted to thank you again for giving me a second chance." Charles looked up, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Second chances are how we grow, David," he said. "You've made mistakes, but what matters is how you've learned from them." David left that night with a renewed sense of purpose. The incident had humbled him, but it had also made him a better employee and a better person. Months passed, and Bright Horizons Bistro was as bustling as ever. David had fully reintegrated into the team, earning back the respect of his colleagues and the trust of his manager, Rachel. He had transformed into a standout employee, someone who handled challenging situations with composure and empathy. The incident with Charles was no longer an open wound, but a lesson he carried with him every day. As David polished glasses behind the bar one evening, he reflected on how far he had come. He thought about the assumptions he had made about Charles and how those assumptions had blinded him to the man's character. More than anything, David was grateful for the opportunity to grow. The experience had taught him the importance of humility, empathy, and separating personal feelings from professional duties. Across the restaurant, Charles sat at his usual booth, quietly observing the team. As the owner, he made it a point to spend time in each of his establishments, ensuring that his vision of inclusion and respect was upheld. Watching David interact warmly with a group of customers, Charles felt a sense of pride, not just in the restaurant, but in the growth he had witnessed. Later that night, as the last customers left and the staff began cleaning up, Charles approached David. "How are things going?" he asked. David straightened up, a smile on his face. "Really well, Mr. Griffin. I've learned so much these past few months." Charles nodded. "I can see that. Your growth hasn't gone unnoticed, not by me or your colleagues." David hesitated, then said, "I still think about that day. It was a hard lesson, but one I needed. Thank you for giving me the chance to learn." Charles smiled faintly. "We all need second chances, David. What matters is what we do with them." As Charles prepared to leave, he paused at the door, looking back at the bustling restaurant. The clinking of dishes and warm laughter of the staff filled the air, a harmony he cherished. For him, Bright Horizons Bistro wasn't just a business. It was a place where people learned, grew, and connected. David watched him go, a renewed sense of purpose settling in his chest. The man he once judged had become a mentor, and the experience had forever changed the way David saw the world and himself.